It was a bright morning in the heart of the city, the kind of day when the sun shone just the right amount, neither too hot nor too cold. Jade Turner, a respected federal judge, had always cherished the quiet moments that these mornings provided. She wasn't one for the limelight, despite the long list of accolades and praise she had received throughout her career. For most of her life, she had lived in the shadows of her profession, choosing to focus on justice rather than recognition. Today, however, she had decided to step away from the courthouse and take a walk in the park. She had heard about a new exhibit being put up in the city's downtown area, an art installation about racial inequality. While the topic was close to her heart, Jade had been reluctant to attend large public events lately. Her work as a judge required her to maintain a certain distance from public opinion, from politics, from anything that might seem to taint her ability to make impartial decisions. But this walk, alone and with no particular goal other than clearing her mind, seemed like the perfect escape from the constant demands of her courtroom. Jade was not the type to draw attention to herself, preferring instead to blend in with the crowd. Dressed casually in a simple black jacket, jeans, and comfortable sneakers, she looked like any other woman in her 40s, calm, collected, and determined. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her brown eyes were sharp, scanning the surroundings as she walked. Despite the serene morning, something in the air felt different. The usual calm of the park, which Jade had visited countless times over the years, seemed charged with tension. Maybe it was just her, or perhaps she had picked up on something that everyone else had been ignoring, the ripple of change that had started to stir in their city. The park was busier than usual. Families strolled along the winding paths, children ran and played by the fountain, and joggers passed by with their headphones on. It was a small moment of normalcy in an otherwise chaotic world. But something felt off about the crowd that day. Jade's senses, honed through years of practice in the courtroom, told her that there was more to this scene than met the eye. She continued walking, her thoughts lingering on her work. It had been a long week in the courthouse, filled with tough cases, high-profile trials, and plenty of moments that tested her patience. The weight of the decisions she had to make often sat heavy on her shoulders, but she carried it with grace. Today, though, Jade didn't want to think about work. She needed a break, a moment of peace. That's when she noticed him, Officer Mark Peterson. He was standing near a bench, arms folded, scanning the park with an almost predatory gaze. Jade knew him by reputation. He was one of the officers who had made headlines for controversial actions in the past. A recent incident involving an unarmed black man, a questionable arrest, and accusations of racial profiling had brought Officer Peterson into the public eye. While some praised him as a hero, others labeled him as a symbol of the corruption within the department. Jade had heard both sides of the story, but as a judge, she chose not to take sides publicly. She maintained an unwavering belief in the rule of law, even when it was difficult to do so. As she passed by, Jade caught Peterson's eye. She didn't think much of it, he was a police officer doing his job. But then, as she continued walking, she noticed something strange. He began following her at a distance, his eyes never leaving her. Jade quickened her pace, chalking it up to coincidence, but a sense of unease began to creep in. She had been a judge long enough to understand when someone was scrutinizing her. She had felt the stares in courtrooms, the judgment in the eyes of attorneys, witnesses, and even the defendants. But this was different. This was something far more dangerous. Peterson continued to trail behind her, getting closer with each step. Jade knew she had to do something. She turned abruptly, stopping in her tracks and facing him. Her eyes narrowed, but she made no move to confront him directly. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked, her voice calm yet firm. The cop froze for a moment, as if caught off guard by her directness. He had probably expected her to keep walking, to avoid the confrontation, as so many others might have done. But Jade was no ordinary woman. Her confidence was her shield, and she knew how to handle situations like this. "You look suspicious," Peterson said, his tone accusing. "What's your business here?" Jade's heart skipped a beat. The words hit her like a slap. She had never been one to back down from an unjust accusation, but the way Peterson said it, with such certainty, made her pause for just a moment. It wasn't lost on her that he had targeted her based on something other than her behavior. She wasn't acting out of place. She wasn't causing a scene. But it seemed clear to her that his judgment had already been made, before she had even opened her mouth. "I'm simply taking a walk," Jade replied evenly, her posture remaining straight. "I have every right to be here." "I'll be the judge of that," Peterson sneered. His eyes scanned her again, lingering just a bit too long on her skin tone, and Jade felt a chill run down her spine. She was no stranger to discrimination, but to have it so boldly presented to her face, without even the pretense of politeness, was a reminder of how far society still had to go. Without warning, Peterson reached out and grabbed her arm. Jade immediately jerked back, her body tense with a surge of adrenaline. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice now rising with authority. She was a judge, after all, and knew her rights well. She could feel the eyes of bystanders on her, but none of them intervened. They were either too afraid or too indifferent to step in. "You're under arrest," Peterson said, his grip tightening. "For trespassing." Jade's mouth went dry. "I'm not trespassing. I'm not breaking any laws." "Tell that to the judge," he snapped, already reaching for his handcuffs. Jade's mind raced. She was a federal judge, one of the highest authorities in the courtroom. She could have easily revealed her identity right then and there, but something held her back. She knew that if she did, it would escalate the situation in ways that might not be helpful. There was a way to handle this, a way to turn the situation in her favor, but it required patience. It required control. As Peterson tried to handcuff her, Jade remained calm, keeping her body still and her words deliberate. "I am a federal judge," she said, her voice steady. "You have no right to arrest me. I demand to speak to your supervisor." But Peterson wasn't listening. He continued to push her forward toward his patrol car, dragging her in the direction of the police station. For a brief moment, Jade's mind flashed to her courtroom, to the cases she had overseen, to the people she had fought for. She had dedicated her life to justice. But now, standing in front of this officer, she realized that justice wasn't always as simple as it seemed in the courtroom. As the officer shoved her into the back of the patrol car, Jade's thoughts raced. There was something bigger at play here, something far more dangerous than a simple arrest. This wasn't just about her. This was about the system that allowed men like Peterson to wield power over innocent people with impunity. And this was about to get a whole lot more complicated than anyone could imagine. The patrol car's doors slammed shut, and the cold, metal interior felt like a stark contrast to the warmth of the morning sun that had disappeared moments before. Jade Turner, still in disbelief, sat in the back, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her mind spinning as the car jolted forward. The harsh scent of the vinyl seats filled her nose, and she closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. What had just happened? How had it escalated so quickly? Jade had faced adversity before, but this was something else entirely. As a judge, she was used to being in control, commanding respect in the courtroom and outside of it. But here, she was being treated like a criminal. And all because of the color of her skin. She had seen the way Peterson had looked at her earlier, his eyes scanning her as if she was something to be disposed of, a target in his eyes. His treatment of her wasn't just personal, it was a reflection of a larger, more insidious issue that ran deep in the fabric of society. Racism wasn't just a matter of words, it was an action, a deliberate effort to strip people of their dignity and their rights. Jade's mind raced back to the moment when Peterson had laid hands on her. The shock of it, the rawness of the accusation, had made her momentarily freeze. But she had quickly regained her composure, fighting back against the urge to let fear take over. She had worked her whole life to get to where she was, to gain respect, and to fight for justice. Now, she was being told that none of that mattered. The car's tires squealed as they made a sharp turn, jolting Jade back to the present. They were headed toward the police station, but Jade wasn't sure how this was going to unfold. She didn't know what would happen next or how far Peterson would push this, but she was no longer willing to back down. She had seen too many instances of people being mistreated, their voices silenced by the system that was supposed to protect them. Today, it wasn't just about her. It was about making sure that something larger than her own personal injustice was addressed. This was the moment to stand her ground. The drive seemed to take forever, each passing second like an eternity. Jade's thoughts bounced from one realization to the next, each one a reminder of the hard truth she was facing. She could feel the weight of the injustice pressing in on her, but she wasn't one to back down. She had dealt with worse in her career, from corrupt officials to criminal defendants who believed they could manipulate the system. But now, it was the system itself that was out of control. When they finally arrived at the police station, the doors were thrown open, and a uniformed officer, unfamiliar to Jade, stepped forward. His expression was unreadable as he glanced at her, then at Peterson. There was a brief exchange between the two, hushed words that Jade couldn't hear, but she could sense the tension. She had no idea what Peterson had told his colleague, but it didn't take much to guess. "Bring her inside," the officer said, his voice sharp. As they escorted her into the station, Jade felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, but also a steely resolve. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let Peterson and others like him continue to abuse their power. She wasn't going to be the next person silenced by their prejudice. She was a judge, and she knew the law better than anyone. If anyone could turn this around, it was her. Inside the station, the walls were cold, sterile, and indifferent. Officers milled about, some talking in low voices, others sorting through paperwork. It was a typical scene in any police station, but today it felt like a suffocating cage, a place where injustice and corruption could thrive under the guise of law and order. They led Jade to a small room, its walls bare and its air heavy with the smell of stale coffee and sweat. "Sit," Peterson ordered, his voice grating against her nerves. Jade didn't move. She stood tall, her back straight, refusing to show any sign of weakness. "I'm not sitting," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not a criminal." Peterson's face reddened, his patience wearing thin. He stepped closer, and for a moment, Jade thought he might try to force her down, but he stopped himself. Instead, he stood there, glaring at her with a look that screamed arrogance. "You'll sit when I tell you," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. But Jade remained unmoved. "I know my rights, officer," she said evenly. "I have not committed a crime, and I demand to speak to your supervisor. Immediately." The silence in the room hung like a weight. Peterson seemed to hesitate, his hand hovering near his radio, but he didn't make a move to call anyone. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Jade's heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. She was alone now, with nothing but the sound of her own breath to keep her company. She had no idea how long she sat there, but eventually, the door opened, and a woman entered the room. She was in her late 40s, with short black hair and a stern but professional demeanor. Her name tag read Detective Thompson. She was no doubt another officer, but something about her presence was different. She wasn't here to intimidate, she was here to solve a problem. "You're Judge Turner, aren't you?" she asked, her voice gentle but authoritative. Jade nodded. "Yes, I am." Thompson seemed to consider this for a moment, then sat down across from her. "I'm sorry for the way things are going, but there's been some misunderstanding. Officer Peterson doesn't know who you are, and it's gotten out of hand. I'm here to make sure this gets straightened out." Jade could feel the weight of the moment shift slightly. She wasn't completely out of the woods yet, but at least now someone was acknowledging the absurdity of the situation. He doesn't know who I am. Of course, he doesn't. He just sees the color of my skin and thinks I'm guilty of something. Thompson didn't say anything right away, but her eyes softened with understanding. I understand. But you have to understand that there's a lot of tension right now. Tensions between the police and the community, especially with all the recent incidents. I know it doesn't excuse what happened, but we're trying to handle it as best we can. Jade felt a flicker of frustration rise within her. Trying to handle it? By arresting me? I've been in this city for years. I've served the law with honor. And this, she gestured to her cuffs, to the sterile room, to everything that had transpired in the last hour. This is how I'm treated? Thompson held up a hand, signaling Jade to stop. I know. And I don't want you to think this is the norm. This is not how we do things, Judge Turner. But Peterson, he has a history. And his actions today were a result of his own biases, something we're working to address. Jade took a deep breath, letting the words sink in. It wasn't enough, but at least Thompson acknowledged the issue. The detective was right about one thing: Peterson's actions were just another example of the biases deeply embedded in the system. But acknowledging the problem didn't solve it. It didn't erase the damage that had already been done, nor would it fix the broken trust between law enforcement and the community. I want this on record, Jade said firmly, her voice unwavering. I want a public apology. I want accountability for what's happened here. Thompson nodded, her face serious. I will make sure your request is heard. And I will make sure Peterson faces the consequences of his actions. I promise you that. Jade finally allowed herself to relax, just a little. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in hours, she felt a glimmer of hope that justice might still prevail, even when it seemed impossible. The tension in the room seemed to dissipate slightly as Detective Thompson stood up and motioned for Jade to follow her. Jade was still shaken by everything that had happened, but she felt a small flicker of hope rising in her chest. The situation was far from over, but Thompson's willingness to listen and acknowledge the wrongs gave Jade a sense of agency she hadn't had before. Still, the question lingered in the back of her mind: how far would she have to push before real change came? Would Peterson be held accountable, or would this be swept under the rug like so many other incidents before it? As they made their way through the police station, Jade couldn't help but notice the lingering stares from officers and clerks alike. Some were wary, some were curious, but no one spoke. It was a silent acknowledgement of the tension that had built up, but no one dared to break the silence. The walls of the station felt like they were closing in on her, the weight of systemic racism pressing down on her shoulders. The doors to the back office opened with a low creak as Thompson ushered Jade inside. There, she was met with a middle-aged man in a suit, his eyes sharp but weary, as if he had seen too much in his years on the force. This is Captain Reynolds, Thompson introduced him, and Jade immediately took in the rigid posture and the air of authority around him. He's the one who'll be looking into the situation and ensuring that the necessary actions are taken. Jade nodded, her mind still racing as she sat across from Reynolds. She could see the skepticism in his eyes, but he was careful not to show it. It was clear that he didn't want to be seen as another obstacle in her fight for justice, but Jade had learned long ago that appearances were often deceiving. She had seen enough in her years as a federal judge to know that the truth could be distorted, twisted, and hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and indifference. She needed to be sure that this wouldn't be another empty promise. I know this isn't easy, Judge Turner, Reynolds began, his voice measured. But we're going to make sure that everything is handled appropriately. I'm going to personally review Peterson's actions, and I'll make sure that his conduct is thoroughly investigated. If there's any misconduct, rest assured, he'll be held accountable. Jade didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to look at him for a moment. She could sense the sincerity in his words, but she wasn't sure if it was enough. This wasn't just about Peterson, this was about a broken system that needed more than just a single officer to be held accountable. This was about changing the culture within the department, about addressing the systemic issues that allowed officers like Peterson to continue their behavior unchecked. "I appreciate your assurance, Captain," Jade said, her voice firm but steady. "But I need more than just an investigation. I need you to understand that this isn't an isolated incident. This is part of a much larger issue, one that goes far beyond this station and beyond just one officer. What happened today isn't just about Peterson's actions. It's about a culture of racism that still exists in law enforcement." Reynolds looked at her intently, his brow furrowed. "I understand your concerns, Judge Turner, and I agree that systemic racism is a real issue. But we can't change everything overnight. We need to take this one step at a time." Jade felt the anger rising again, but she took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She had worked too hard for this moment, too long in the trenches of justice, to let her emotions get the better of her now. "One step at a time," she repeated softly, almost to herself. "That's exactly what's been said for years. And every time it's one step, the steps get smaller and smaller until nothing changes. What happened today is the result of years of complacency, years of letting officers like Peterson get away with their behavior. The longer we let that continue, the harder it becomes to break the cycle." There was a long silence between them as Captain Reynolds absorbed her words. He seemed to be weighing her points, considering the larger picture, but Jade knew that for this to truly change, it would take more than just one person in a position of power recognizing the problem. It would take the entire system to come together, to acknowledge its flaws, and to make a collective commitment to fixing them. "We'll do everything we can to address this," Reynolds finally said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But I need you to understand that this process takes time. We'll need evidence, we'll need testimony, and we'll need to go through the proper channels." Jade knew that. She had been through the legal process enough to understand how the wheels of justice turned, slowly, sometimes painfully so. But what was at stake here was more than just the case of one officer. It was about the larger fight for equality and fairness in a system that too often overlooked the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long. "I understand that, Captain," Jade replied, her voice firm. "But make no mistake. I'm not going to let this slide. I won't stop pushing until this is dealt with." As they finished their conversation, Jade left the station with a mix of emotions swirling inside her. There were still so many unknowns, so many steps that had to be taken before she could feel like justice had been truly served. But she had made one thing clear to the police department: this wasn't just about her. This was about everyone who had been hurt by the system, everyone who had been treated unfairly because of their race. Jade returned to her office later that afternoon, the weight of the day pressing down on her like a physical burden. She couldn't shake the image of Peterson's face, the disdain in his eyes as he had dismissed her. But as she sat at her desk, looking at the stack of cases before her, she realized something: this wasn't just about making sure Peterson was held accountable. This was about changing the narrative, about showing that the justice system could be a force for good, could be the thing that helped heal the deep wounds that had been inflicted over generations. But it would take more than just one case to fix it. Jade knew that now more than ever. As she picked up the phone to call her assistant, a new resolve washed over her. She wasn't just fighting for one person or one case, she was fighting for all of them. The fight had only just begun, and she was ready to lead the charge. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, calls, and paperwork. But amidst it all, Jade felt an unwavering determination. The weight of the case, of the larger fight she had committed herself to, pushed her forward. It wasn't just about Peterson anymore. It was about making sure that the voices of those who had been silenced for so long were finally heard, and that the system, flawed as it was would begin to acknowledge the injustices that had been allowed to thrive within it. At the same time, the repercussions of the incident at the police station were starting to ripple through the community. Word had gotten out about the arrest, and the media began picking up on the story. But the narrative was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was an opportunity to shine a spotlight on the issue of racism within law enforcement, to give people a voice who had long been ignored. On the other hand, it was a chance for those in power to downplay the severity of the situation, to frame the entire ordeal as an isolated incident rather than a symptom of a much larger, deeply ingrained problem. Jade was determined not to let that happen. She knew that this was her moment, her opportunity to not just seek justice for herself, but to demand accountability on a much broader scale. She had the tools, the knowledge, and the platform to push for real change, and she wasn't about to waste it. As the story continued to gain traction, the pressure began to mount. Protests began to form outside the police station, organized by community groups who had been following the case. Their chants were loud, their demands clear: accountability, justice, and a change in the system. Jade had always been supportive of peaceful protests in the past, but now, seeing the raw emotion and anger of the people who had been affected by systemic racism, it hit her differently. It was no longer an abstract issue to her, it was personal. It was about the very people she had fought for in her career, the individuals whose rights had been trampled for too long. The protests made it impossible for the media to ignore the story any longer. News outlets picked up on the outrage, and public figures began weighing in on the situation. Some offered support, calling for a full investigation into Peterson's conduct. Others, however, questioned Jade's motives, attempting to discredit her by focusing on her position as a federal judge. It was a tactic she had seen before, a way to distract from the issue at hand by attacking the messenger. But Jade refused to be distracted. The truth was on her side, and she would make sure that it came to light, no matter how many people tried to twist it. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Jade sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through the latest coverage of the case. She had seen the news reports, heard the pundits weighing in with their opinions, but it all felt distant. The voices of the people who were actually affected by the injustice were what mattered most, not the talking heads on television. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Detective Thompson again. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, as if they were old friends rather than people who had only met in the wake of an incident that had set everything in motion. "We've got a problem," Thompson said, her voice tense. Jade looked up from her phone, her brow furrowing. "What's happened?" "Peterson's lawyer is calling for a dismissal of the charges. They're arguing that the arrest was justified, that you were disruptive, that you were non-compliant." Jade stood up, pacing the room. The audacity of it all, after everything that had happened, after the fact that she was a federal judge, Peterson's defense was attempting to paint her as the aggressor. It was a common tactic, one she had seen countless times in her career. She had always known that justice wasn't always fair, but this was a different level of manipulation. "Are they serious?" Jade asked, her voice low. "How can they justify this? How can they pretend that this wasn't an act of racial profiling?" "They're trying to make it about you, Judge," Thompson replied, her face hardening. "They're trying to shift the focus away from Peterson's actions and make it look like you were the one who caused the scene." Jade stopped pacing and turned to face Thompson, a plan already forming in her mind. "We can't let them do this. We can't let them make this about me. This is about Peterson and his actions, and I'm not going to let them hide behind lies and deflection." Thompson nodded, a look of admiration in her eyes. "I'm with you. We're not backing down." In the days that followed, Jade doubled down on her efforts. She began reaching out to legal experts, journalists, and activists who had been following the case, determined to gather as much support as possible. It wasn't enough to just have the facts on her side, she needed to create a movement, a force that would be impossible to ignore. She wasn't just fighting for her own dignity or for the consequences Peterson deserved. She was fighting for the many who had been subjected to similar treatment, whose voices had been silenced by a system that didn't care. As the case progressed, it became clear that Peterson was starting to feel the heat. He had no idea just how much of a storm he had unleashed when he decided to target the wrong person. The media circus surrounding the case was beginning to affect his reputation, and there were rumblings within the department itself. His colleagues, once silent, began to speak out, sharing their own stories of misconduct, of the things they had seen and heard behind closed doors. Jade knew that this was a pivotal moment. Peterson was no longer just a rogue officer. He was a symbol, a focal point for everything that had gone wrong within the system. The community continued to rally behind Jade, demanding accountability and systemic change. The protests grew larger, the voices of the people stronger. But amid all the noise, Jade remained focused. She wasn't just fighting for justice in this one case, she was fighting to change the very foundation of a broken system. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But she knew that the fight for real change was always worth it. In the courtroom, as the days of testimony and cross-examinations unfolded, Jade felt an unshakable sense of resolve. She was no longer just a judge, she was a beacon of hope for a community that had been overlooked for too long. And no matter what came next, she would never back down from this fight. The stakes were too high, the consequences too important. It wasn't just about Peterson anymore, it was about everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that had failed them. Jade was ready to see it through, no matter the cost. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The case against Officer Peterson had gained national attention, and every word spoken seemed to weigh heavily on the future of the case, and by extension, the broader issue of systemic racism in law enforcement. Jade stood at the front of the room, unwavering, her eyes locked on Peterson as he sat at the defendant's table, his lawyer beside him, both looking increasingly uneasy. The prosecution had built a compelling case, but Jade knew that the true power of this moment lay not in the legal arguments, but in the broader truth that was being laid bare for the world to see. As the day wore on, the tension between the defense and the prosecution escalated. The defense attorneys attempted to paint Jade as an aggressive and uncooperative figure, arguing that her actions, however justified in her eyes, had contributed to the escalation of the situation. They tried to downplay Peterson's conduct, suggesting that he was merely performing his duty in the face of what they deemed provocation. But every attempt to discredit Jade was met with sharp, pointed rebuttals from the prosecution, and from the growing public support that was backing Jade. The more the defense tried to spin their narrative, the clearer it became that their story was built on lies. In the midst of the courtroom drama, the media continued to cover the case extensively. Every morning, Jade would wake up to dozens of notifications on her phone, news outlets reporting on the latest developments, social media buzzing with opinions from across the country. It was surreal to see her name splashed across every headline. But it wasn't about her, it never had been. It was about the message that was being broadcast to the public, a message about accountability, about standing up against injustice, and about the courage it took to fight back. Jade's role in this battle was one of many. She was simply the face of a larger movement, a movement that had been growing for years and was now gaining unstoppable momentum. The courtroom itself had become a battlefield, with each side vying for the truth, trying to present the most compelling argument. But Jade wasn't just relying on her legal skills, she had something far more important on her side. She had lived through the pain, the fear, and the trauma that Peterson's actions had triggered in so many people, and she carried that with her into the courtroom every day. She wasn't just a federal judge making a ruling, she was a woman with a deep understanding of the stakes, of the lives that had been affected by the events that had led to this moment. In one of the most powerful moments of the trial, Jade took the stand to testify. She had been prepared for this moment for weeks, but when she stood before the court, the weight of the situation hit her in a way she hadn't expected. The questions came fast and furious, each one designed to break her down, to make her question her actions, to undermine her credibility. But Jade stood tall, answering each question with a calmness that stunned the room. She spoke not just about what had happened to her in that moment at the police station, but about the years of injustice that had led to that moment. She spoke of the countless individuals who had been treated the same way she had, and of the deep, systemic issues that continued to perpetuate such behavior. It wasn't just her story she was telling, it was the story of a community that had been oppressed for far too long. The defense tried to paint her words as exaggerated, as emotional, but the truth of what she said was undeniable. The room fell silent as she spoke of the hurt and the fear that had coursed through her veins when Peterson had arrested her, and the indignity of being treated as a criminal simply because of the color of her skin. She spoke of the years she had spent fighting for justice, and how this moment had become not just a personal battle, but a fight for every person who had ever been unfairly targeted, who had ever been made to feel less than human. When she finished, there was a brief pause before the courtroom erupted into a quiet murmur. The defense attorney sat back, clearly stunned by the raw honesty of her testimony. Jade had just done what they had hoped to avoid. She had humanized the issue, made it real in a way that no amount of legal maneuvering could undo. The following days were filled with more testimony, more arguments, but Jade had already made her mark. It was clear that Peterson's defense team was struggling to maintain their narrative. They had underestimated the power of Jade's voice, the strength of her conviction, and the resolve of the people who were supporting her. They had believed they could deflect, obfuscate, and twist the facts, but Jade had refused to let that happen. She was playing the long game, and with every piece of evidence, with every word she spoke, she was pushing them closer to the truth. As the trial continued, Jade's role as both a judge and a symbol became more pronounced. The pressure was immense. The media scrutiny was unrelenting, and the pressure to deliver a verdict that would satisfy both the legal system and the demands of the public weighed heavily on her. But Jade had long ago learned that justice was not about pleasing everyone, it was about doing what was right. And in this case, the right thing was clear. The climax of the trial came when the jury returned with their verdict. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood and read the decision: guilty. Officer Peterson had been convicted of misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of power. The room erupted in a mix of cheers and stunned silence, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. For Jade, it was a bittersweet victory. She had won, yes, but the battle was far from over. This was just one small step toward changing a system that had been broken for so long. In the weeks that followed, the ripples of the trial continued to spread throughout the community and beyond. Protests became more organized, more focused. People began to demand real change, not just in law enforcement but in every institution that upheld systemic racism. Jade had become a leader in that movement, a symbol of the fight for justice, and she knew that the work was just beginning. But there was one thing she had not expected: the overwhelming support from people who had once been silent. Former colleagues, members of the legal community, and even citizens who had never met her began to reach out, offering their congratulations, their support, and their solidarity. It was a humbling experience, but one that reinforced her belief in the power of collective action. Change was possible, but it required the strength of everyone who was willing to stand up, to speak out, and to fight for what was right. Jade took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened, the personal toll it had taken on her, the emotional exhaustion, the sleepless nights. But in the end, it had all been worth it. She had stood up not just for herself, but for every person who had been wronged by a broken system. She had made a difference, and she would continue to fight for justice, no matter the cost. And as the world continued to watch, Jade knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but as long as people like her were willing to stand up, there was hope that change was within reach. The system might be slow to change, but with every step forward, with every victory, they were getting closer to the truth, closer to a future where justice was truly blind to race, class, and privilege. The following weeks after the trial were a whirlwind of emotions, debates, and media attention. The streets outside the courthouse were flooded with protesters, supporters chanting Jade's name, holding signs demanding justice and systemic change. News outlets covered the verdict extensively, broadcasting interviews with activists, legal experts, and community leaders. Yet through it all, Jade remained a steadfast figure. She had won the case, but there was still so much work left to do. The trial had been a monumental moment, but for Jade, it was just the beginning of a much larger fight for justice and accountability. As the days passed, Jade found herself facing new challenges. The weight of the victory hung heavy on her shoulders. She had just made history, and yet, it felt as though the real battle had only begun. Conversations about the trial continued to dominate national headlines, but Jade knew that the true test of the victory lay in its impact on the larger issue of racial inequality in law enforcement and society. Would this be just another fleeting moment in the ongoing fight for justice, or could it lead to real, lasting change? Jade had always been committed to fairness, to seeing the law through a lens that ensured equality and protection for everyone. But the system had failed her before. It had failed countless others before her, and Jade could not allow this moment of victory to slip into complacency. She refused to be a part of a broken system that allowed injustice to persist. She became determined to use the platform she had gained to push for reforms, to challenge the policies that allowed people like Officer Peterson to misuse their power with impunity. Despite the heavy scrutiny, the pressure of the world watching, Jade worked tirelessly behind the scenes, advocating for the changes she knew were necessary. She joined with civil rights organizations, speaking at rallies and town halls, making her voice heard across the nation. With each speech, Jade found her resolve growing stronger, as though the echoes of her past, her struggles, and the struggles of so many others were propelling her forward. One of the most powerful moments came when she was invited to speak at a congressional hearing on police reform. The room was filled with lawmakers, activists, and members of the public who had watched her case unfold. They had seen the injustice that had been done, and now they were eager to hear her vision for a more just and equitable system. Jade's testimony was unlike anything the committee had ever heard before. She didn't just speak of policy changes or legal reforms, she spoke of the human cost of systemic racism, of the lives destroyed by police brutality, of the fear that had been instilled in entire communities. Jade's words struck at the heart of the issue, and the room was silent as she shared her story of how she had felt in that moment when she was wrongfully arrested, humiliated, and unjustly treated. As Jade spoke, there was a noticeable shift in the room. Lawmakers began to pay closer attention, taking notes, leaning forward. There was a sense of urgency in the air, as if, for the first time, people were truly understanding the depth of the problem. But Jade knew that words alone would not be enough. Real change would require action, and she made it clear that the time for change was now. She demanded that the government hold law enforcement accountable, that they implement training programs to address racial bias, and that they ensure that every officer who violated the public's trust would face the consequences of their actions. It wasn't long before other prominent figures joined Jade's cause. Activists, lawyers, and even former police officers who had grown disillusioned with the system rallied behind her, creating a unified front demanding justice. The movement gained momentum, and soon, legislative hearings were being held across the country to address police violence and accountability. Jade's case had ignited a spark, and it was quickly spreading, turning into a full-fledged movement. Yet, despite all the progress being made, Jade could not forget the personal cost of her journey. Every day, she faced new challenges, new attempts to undermine her. There were still those who questioned her motives, who believed that her actions had been extreme or misguided. They accused her of undermining law enforcement and dividing the country. But Jade remained undeterred. The people who mattered, the ones who had been oppressed, who had suffered under the weight of injustice, understood the truth. They knew what Jade had been fighting for, and they were behind her every step of the way. But even as the fight for justice began to gain traction, Jade found herself struggling with the emotional toll of everything she had been through. The stress of the trial, the constant media attention, and the weight of carrying the hopes of so many people on her shoulders began to take its toll. Jade had always been a rock, strong and unwavering, but now, for the first time in a long while, she felt the cracks forming. She began to question the choices she had made, wondering if she was truly prepared for the burden of being a leader in such a movement. Could she continue to fight, or was it time to step back and let someone else take the lead? The answer came to her one evening, as she sat alone in her office, staring at the piles of paperwork, the books, and the legal documents. She thought about everything she had gone through, the countless hours she had spent reading cases, attending meetings, preparing her testimony. She thought about the people who had come to her for help, the young activists who had seen her as a beacon of hope. And she realized that stepping back wasn't an option. She had come too far, fought too hard, and sacrificed too much to turn away now. Jade made a decision then, one that would shape the future of her life and the movement she had helped build. She would continue the fight. She would push for more systemic reforms. She would make sure that Officer Peterson's conviction was just the beginning, that justice would be served, not just in this case, but in every case where the law had been used as a tool of oppression. She would dedicate her life to making sure that no one else would have to face the kind of injustice she had endured. And with that decision, Jade knew that her fight was not just a personal crusade, it was a cause that would carry her through the rest of her life, one that would inspire future generations to continue the battle for justice, no matter the cost. In the months that followed, Jade's name became synonymous with the fight for racial justice and police accountability. She was invited to speak at international conferences, consulted by lawmakers and government officials around the world. But through it all, Jade remained grounded in her mission. She knew that the fight was far from over, that there would always be new battles to fight, new challenges to overcome. But as long as she had the strength to keep going, she would continue to stand up for what was right. Her victory had been hard-won, but it had ignited a movement that would change the world. And as Jade looked ahead to the future, she knew that the fight for justice would never stop. It would be a long, difficult journey, but one worth every ounce of effort. Because, in the end, the fight for justice was not just about one person, it was about all of us, together, demanding a better world for future generations.